Good day. Resident Evil is a game that I've always wanted to like, but for the longest time I never did. I first played it on the Nintendo DS and found it to be too confusing and too annoying, and I felt that it was hard for the sake of hard, and that I had to fight the interface more than I actually had to fight the zombies. If we look back on my YouTube career, we can see that as late as 2010, that I still didn't have all that many good things to say about Resident Evil 1. As for the very first Resident Evil, I hated it. As for its remake, I hated it even more. Now please keep in mind, this is only my opinion, so please, no flames! Ah, the ignorance of youth, and damn, I gotta do that flamethrower bit again. That was bloody awesome! So yes, as of 2010, I hated Resident Evil 1. But then again, I was in my hate period, and well, I just hated games for all sorts of flimsy reasons. It would not be until 2011, when I would meet Mizio, that I would actually start to exit my hate period. Now, of course, I would be introduced to a wide variety of new games by Mizio, but by far the one that was the most influential was Dark Souls. Dark Souls was the first of these new games that I really liked. Dark Souls is a punishingly hard and rather complex game that does not hold one's hand at any time. It was due to this game that I started to get interested in games that I'd once dismissed as hard for the sake of hard or interface fighters. And if you want to see a review of this game, just click the link. Despite being introduced to all these new games and learning to like Dark Souls, I still did not give Resident Evil 1 its fair shake. And it would not be until a 6-month period when my graphics card died and I was left with an emergency graphics card that I would finally sit down and play Resident Evil 1 and give it the chance it so rightly deserved. And when I did, I certainly was not disappointed. So now, let's take a close look at the gaming masterpiece that is Resident Evil 1. Development of Resident Evil began in 1993 and was initially proposed by Tokuro Fujiwara, who was director of the game Shinji Mikami's mentor. The initial inspiration for Resident Evil was the 1989 game Sweet Home. Sweet Home was directed by the later producer of Resident Evil, Tokuro Fujiwara, and was a Famicom game based upon a film of the same name. The game itself is a proto-survival horror game and features a limited inventory system like Resident Evil and has one solving puzzles and things of that nature. Really, this could be considered a Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil initially was supposed to be a remake of Sweet Home, with Fujiwara citing that he could be able to make use of improved hardware to do things he couldn't do before. And that is one of the great aspects of 90s developers. They wanted to push the boundaries. They wanted to do things different, and they wanted to break new ground. Today, AAA developers only care about shoveling out more gray mush in the vain hope that they might make some COD-level money. The one thing they don't realize is that gamers want new things, not the same old crap they've been getting for years. Now, Fujiwara did say, according to Wikipedia at least, that he could improve the graphics, but that was in addition to the gameplay, and not the only concern. Now, for Resident Evil, he chose to produce it instead of directing it, giving that task to Shinji Mikami, who hated being scared. Fujiwara thought that this would be quite the boon, as Mikami's hatred of being frightened would help in determining what was really scary. When development started, Mikami worked on the game alone for 6 months and created a 40-page script along with concept art and character designs. Eventually, it would be determined that Resident Evil would be a first-person perspective remake of Sweet Home. A prototype would be produced, but was cited as technically not good enough. The prototype featured the horror stylings of Sweet Home and was more Japanese in mindset, but this would be changed to a simpler B-movie zombie horror styling. And it was during the production of the game that Mikami discovered the game Alone in the Dark, itself another proto-survival horror game that used the now famous changing camera angle system. Mikami cites that had it not been for Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil would have been a first-person game instead. Now, for all the complaints about the camera system in Resident Evil, Miyakami was not necessarily happy with it either, citing that it had an effect on immersion, making the player feel a bit detached. But, as we know now, he used them anyway, as it allowed for the use of pre-rendered backdrops that allowed a higher level of detail. During development, two characters of, shall we say, dubious quality were conceived: Dewey, an African-American man who was supposed to be a comic relief character, and Gelzer, a cyborg of all things, who was meant to be a strongman character. Thankfully, they were both scrapped and replaced by the much more sensible Rebecca Chambers and Barry Burton. At one stage of development, there was supposed to be a local co-op mode, which sounds cool in theory, but like with Chris Tucker and Schwarzenegger, that would have dampened the horror just a little bit. Towards the end of development, the team would have over 80 people working on the game, and it really shows. What also really shows is just how much a labor of love this game really was. Fujiwara stated this game was initially targeted towards a core audience of gamers and not meant to be super commercial, and he expected only about 200,000 sales. But as we now know, video game enthusiasts are not all drooling morons and actually like a challenge instead of having their intelligence getting insulted all the time. Miyakami was also worried about how well a horror game would do, and an individual named Anpo stated that no one at the time expected the title to be such a success. Who dares wins indeed. In Japan, the game is known as Biohazard, which is fitting enough, but in the US, it is not possible to trademark such a name. So a new name had to be created, and eventually Resident Evil was utilized as the title for the game. And at the time, the creators of that particular name thought it was super cheesy, but it was used because no one could come up with anything better. The game itself was at last released in 1996 to the PlayStation and would enjoy massive sales and huge popularity. In 1997, it would receive an update called the Director's Cut, and that is the version we are going to be taking a look at today. Resident Evil is a third-person survival horror game, but not third-person as we would know it today. Rather, it uses a cinematic camera angling system that takes a little getting used to. As you go through a room, the camera angles change, sort of like you're watching the game through a CCTV system. Now, when I first played this game, I absolutely hated this camera system, as I felt it was overly confusing. But once you get used to it, you'll find it's actually pretty easy to navigate with it, and it does increase the overall tense atmosphere of the game. Really, had it not been for this system, in addition to literally everything else, Resident Evil 1 might not have been as long-lasting in the popular consciousness as it has been. And I would be hard-pressed to imagine this game with any other camera system. Now, since the camera system only shows so much, the sound design must be top bloody notch, and thankfully, it is. All the sounds are well recorded and can help navigation, and the guns also sound quite good as well. The guns for the game actually sound like real guns. While in first-person shooters, you want the bloody shotgun to sound like the Hand of Ysmir, but in real-life, shotguns don't necessarily sound like that. And pistols generally do sound like weak, anemic firecrackers going off. Music for the game is suitably creepy and does set the player on edge. The voice acting actually has an interesting reason to be as bad as it is. The developers were, of course, Japanese, and none of them knew just how special the English voice acting actually was.
Oh, Jill, this house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
What's really crazy is the fact that they canned the Japanese voice acting for being crappy. But to be honest, I feel the crappy voice acting is actually a good thing. The voice acting for the game is yet another aspect of Resident Evil that works when you play the game. When you just talk about Resident Evil, yes, you can chuckle at how terrible the voice acting is, but when you play it, you need that voice acting to be that crappy. Why, you may ask? Because the voice acting serves to calm the player after playing for a long period of time. Because Resident Evil is actually a very creepy game. It's a very tense game. The camera angles, the music, and the sound design all work together to actually make the player feel scared. When you encounter the crappy voice acting, you can calm down a little bit. You can relax and just keep playing the game. You have two characters to choose from, Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield. Each have their own strengths and weaknesses. I prefer to use Jill as she starts with a Beretta 92 and a lockpick. But if you pick Chris, he starts with a knife, more health, and a larger inventory. neither one is truly superior to the other, as in the game you really need to play Inventory Management Simulator 2016. So really, the bigger inventory is quite a boon to say the least. Resident Evil is not a third-person shooter by any means. Really, it's more of a puzzle/exploration game than anything else. Really, when it comes to the zombies, you want to avoid shooting them at all possible, so you can conserve your ammo for fighting real enemies, and you also want to conserve your inventory space as well. Each weapon takes up an inventory slot, and each bit of ammo takes up an inventory slot as well. And all the puzzle items also take up an inventory slot, so really you don't want to be carrying a pistol and shotgun, and thus have no room for a puzzle item. Really, the zombies aren't that big of a threat anyway, and generally running past is the best strategy, unless you absolutely need to kill them because you're going through an area on a regular basis. The puzzles for the game are pretty bloody excellent, and you don't see point-and-click adventure game logic all that much. One thing that really does help with the inventory are these boxes scattered about the game. These boxes here hold your excess crap, and their contents are shared across the game. Initially, the boxes were not supposed to do this. It would have worked in a much more logical fashion. Essentially, if you put an item in a certain box, it will stay in that certain box until you remove it. Now, while this might seem realistic, let's face it, that would have made the game extremely bloody tedious. Now, of course, this particular box method would be used in Resident Evil 0, thus making that game a bit more tedious than the other Resident Evils, in my opinion, at the very least. No flames. The game itself is pretty bloody huge. It's amazing just how big Resident Evil 1 really is. And you will come to almost take up residence in this evil mansion, as this is a long bloody game that will give you countless hours of enjoyment. Unlike in Dark Souls, you do get maps, but sometimes they can be a bit hard to read as some of the symbology is a bit less than clear. But once you figure it out, you will be face-palming with wild abandon. But once again, it will have been you, the player, that figured it out. Graphically, the game looks really quite good and mixes 2D and 3D quite well. The backgrounds are all 2D images, and the player and enemies and items and certain bits of architecture are all 3D models. The 3D models have aged a bit, but they still hold up in my eyes at least, with Jill looking quite cute indeed. And thankfully, unlike in other games, Jill is sensibly dressed. One other cool aspect is how the game handles loading. Instead of an annoying loading bar, you instead have loading doors. This is a cool concept all around, as it does increase tension as you never really know what is on the other side. Saving the game is also handled differently as well. Now, I am of course playing this on the ePSXE emulator, meaning I can quick save at any time, but if you play it on the PlayStation, you would need ink ribbons to save at the typewriters. Now, back in the day, I thought this was really stupid. These days, I think otherwise. If you save strategically, you will have enough ink ribbons, and they can be stored in the boxes. And the boxes are always near typewriters, and you can really get away with not saving all that much if you know what you're doing. And now, let's take a look at the story. The story begins in the space year 1998, and is set in the Arklay Mountains near the fictional city of Raccoon City. The game primarily takes place inside the sprawling Spencer mansion, and the story itself is told in a very decentralized manner. It is up to you, the player, to figure out who all the various players are and what their motivations are. The game features several different characters, but primarily you will be alone, and the story is told quite well through journal entries and things of that nature. Really, Resident Evil has a story that is excellent, and cheesy voice acting aside, you can come to really like the characters in the game, especially as some of them can really pull your ass out of the fire. What's really funny is how old all the characters would be now. Jill was supposed to be my age back in 1998, so she would be in her 40s now, and hell, 18-year-old Rebecca Chambers would be old now too. How time flies, indeed. Another cool aspect about the game is that, in-universe, it makes sense for all the characters in the game to actually survive such a dangerous situation. Jill Valentine was a bloody Delta Force operator. That means that she is even more of a badass than the Doom guy, as he was a Marine, and while Marines are high-level troops in and of themselves, Delta operators are above them in terms of training and effectiveness. And add to that Jill is a woman, you know she has to be a double badass just to make it through the training. Chris also has a military background as well, as he was a member of the Air Force prior to joining up with the Stars. The game's story is also told through FMV cutscenes with live-action actors. and the actress for Jill is almost as attractive as her 3D model. Most of the story is told through in-engine cutscenes that work rather well, even if they have aged a bit. The game strikes a good balance between gameplay and story. Too often today, games are more like interactive movies than anything else. This is in contrast to games of the past where there was almost no story outside of a few text screens, or one or two cutscenes, possibly one at the beginning and one at the end. Resident Evil, on the other hand, strikes what I feel is a perfect balance. The game is neither cutscene heavy nor is it gameplay heavy. Rather, you have both working in harmony with one another. You have long stretches of gameplay, broken with a cutscene to cap it off. Both the story and the gameplay work well to give you a unique entertainment experience. Exactly what video games are supposed to be. Resident Evil is to survival horror what Doom is to first-person shooting. It put survival horror on the map, and its legacy continues to this day. This one game really popularized survival horror. Sure, there were other games prior to this game, but it was not until Resident Evil that survival horror became mainstream. Resident Evil 1 has been ported to everything imaginable, and there's even a prototype of a Game Boy Color version that's actually pretty damn good. There have been 2 remakes for Resident Evil 1, one on the GameCube and one on the PC. Both are excellent and worth checking out. Resident Evil would receive numerous sequels, each of varying quality, with some being as amazing as the first game, and some just being bland and generic. Resident Evil also introduced another kick-ass female character that could go toe-to-toe with the likes of Lara Croft and Samus Aran. Jill Valentine really did become a gaming icon that is still recognizable today. So when someone says that there are no female protagonists in gaming, just show them the kick-ass woman that is Jill. As of 2016, there's going to be a Resident Evil 7. Will it hold true to the past, or will it try to be too modern and thus alienate the fan base? Only time will tell, but as a Resident Evil fan, I'm hoping that it stays true to the masterpiece that is Resident Evil. I highly recommend Resident Evil. Yes, it's going to be tough, but it's worth it. It's a very satisfying game to play, and a very satisfying game to complete. Now, of course, there are many different versions that you can pick up. You can easily get the Director's Cut version that we reviewed today on eBay for very cheap. You can also get it on Steam, which will be the Resident Evil remake, which is pretty much just as good as the original and actually introduces a few new cool concepts. And so, I am GeneralLotz, wishing you good Silent Hill and good Dead Space, or whatever makes you happy. Thank you for watching my review of Resident Evil Director's Cut, and if you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue to bring you these great reviews.